Okay, so we're looking at a new category of Hopkins works, and I didn't give it this label, but they're known as the Terrible Sonnets for a reason. Not that they were written poorly, but I actually did cover two of those already. To seem a stranger lies my lot, and thou art indeed, Lord. Thou art indeed just, Lord. I did those. So here, I'm going to do the numbers 2, 3, and 4. I wake and feel the fell. No worse there is none, and Carrion Comfort. These three sonnets come under the category of his terrible sonnets. And I'll give you a little background on that, why we have a category known as terrible sonnets. And then we'll get right into those sonnets that I said I would cover. The easiest way to do this is, rather than just talk off the cuff, I'm going to read my presentation on it, and then work right through the three sonnets remaining, because there's quite a bit to cover, and if I ramble, talking, it'll be like an hour instead of a half hour. Okay, so in 1883, a change occurred in the Jesuit community, which was to adversely affect Hopkins' life in a psychological way. Up until that time, he had been teaching in the schools and parishes of Wales, Scotland, and England, and writing the bulk of his poetry. Living in an environment that was filled with natural beauty, he was highly inspired, and his writing was likewise highly productive. That year, the Jesuits acquired an institution from the Irish bishops, the Catholic University of Ireland, which is Trinity College, a university located in the bottom of O'Connell Street. Located on Stephen's Green in Dublin, a need was created for a teaching staff of competent professors, and Hopkins, because of his brilliant success at Oxford, was chosen to serve on the new faculty. His assignment was to teach Greek, and in addition to be an examiner, which would require him to read and grade exams from all over Ireland, hundreds of them. So it was very taxing on his time, and would be limiting him in his writing avocation, that he loved to write poetry, so he couldn't do that so much because he was overburdened with all this work. So that's a starter. Hopkins arrived in Dublin in 1884, and his daunting task began immediately. The university was in decrepit conditions. There were rats and poor plumbing, and the furnace system was inadequate, and it was like 40 degrees in the rooms. So his living accommodations were bleak because of lack of heat, and it was a cruel and bitterly cold winter. Additionally, he felt the absence of his close friends, and he didn't like the Irish culture that he was exposed to, and he had few friends there. He had a few, but they were few. The months following his arrival brought bouts of deep depression and an overabundance of work. He was overworked. During this time, he also struggled with unspecified physical ailments, all of which contributed to his terrible bouts of mental anguish, depression. Moreover, it was a time when typhoid was also prevalent in Ireland, and in his weakened condition, he eventually caught the disease, and he died at the young age of 44. So it was a really bleak time in his life, and despite these adversities that he, encountered, he channeled them into his artistic faculty to produce 6 sonnets that addressed his torment of soul. As a group, the sonnets have been dubbed with different names because of the content. Terrible sonnets, or sonnets of terror, sonnets of desolation, and or the dark sonnets. The titles later fixed to these are the ones that you see here. Okay, so we're going to take 3 of those because I did 2 already, and one I'll get around to some other time. So the first is entitled, I Wake and Feel the Fell of Dark, Not Day. I wake and feel the dark of fell, not day. What hours, oh, what black hours we have spent this night. What sights you, heart, saw, ways you went, and more must in yet longer lights delay. With witness I speak this, but where I say hours, I mean years, mean life. And my lament is cries countless, cries like dead letters sent to dearest him that lives, alas, away. I am gall, I am heartburn, God's most deep decree, bitter would have me taste. My taste was me, bones built in me, flesh filled, blood brimmed, the curse, self-yeast of spirit, a dull dough sours. I see the lost are like this, and their scourge to be as I am, their sweating selves, but worse. All right, so I'm going to go right into the analysis rather than, walk through it, and then we'll go back and read it again after the analysis. So, as I said, this is another of his terrible sonnets. It's said that this sonnet is an imaginative exercise in how Hopkins entered into his spiritual exercises of St. Ignatius. The reader is invited into that inner experience in order to engage with it. It is regarded as one of his terrible sonnets, for it undoubtedly reflects some of his emotional state. Yet, it is primarily a poetic expression of his experience of the Ignatian meditation on hell. It is said that his prose reflection on this experience shares imagery closely related to what appears in this poem. This poem describes Hopkins's anguish and near unbearable pain during a period of his darkest days while in Ireland. He wakes in the night and begins to reflect on his status or his present situation in Ireland, being removed from friends and inspiration, as he addressed in his other sonnet, To Seem a Stranger, and then he begins to despise himself. He writes of the darkness not only of the night, but of spirit. Oh, what black hours we have spent. Waking from torments of the soul, he says he feels the fell of dark. It's an interesting choice, the word fell, because it is most often associated with an action, hence a verb, not the expected noun fall. He takes its meaning from the adjective meaning dire or cruel, such as in one fell swoop, as we see in Macbeth. He speaks of the night of black hours and extends it up to 2 years, because that's how it felt to him, and then to his whole entire life. It would seem that way, to him. Then he tells us that his cries are countless and that they are described as dead letters to God. God doesn't seem to be helping him or answering his cry, as we'll see in the next poem as well, when he refers to the Blessed Mother as well. But they are undeliverable, which makes, it even more destitute. The wording here evokes pathos, as he says that they are sent to the dearest friend who lives, alas, so far away. It's almost like my dear friend, and he doesn't even return my call or my letters, leaves me here alone. The sestet then turns to self-loathing, saying, I am gall, I am heartburn. Gall, they gave Jesus gall while he was on the cross. He declares that he is bitter, and God has decreed that he taste his own bitterness. The Spirit should help him rise like bread when put into dough, but this is dull dough, and his bitterness makes it impossible for the dough to rise and for him to rise out of this condition. So there's that metaphor there. He is so soured that he compares himself to the sweating selves of the damned in hell. I see the lost to be like this, like me, experiencing what I'm experiencing, as I am, but worse. He ends the sestet with this ambiguous word, worse, suggesting that either the people in hell are worse than he is, or he is worse than they are. And on this note, which is rather ambiguous, the sonnet ends. So that's why we call it a terrible sonnet, because it's a sonnet of terror in his night dreams and waking with those recollections. I wake and feel the dark of fell, not day. What hours, oh, what black hours we have spent this night. What sights you, heart, have seen. Ways you went, and more must, and yet longer lights delay. With witness I speak this, but where I say hours, I mean years, mean life. And my lament is cries countless, cries like dead letters sent to dearest him that lives lost away. I am gall, I am heartburn, God's most deep decree. Bitter would have me taste. My taste was me, bones built in me, flesh filled, blood brimmed the curse, self yeast of spirit, a dull dough, sours. I see the lost are like this, and their scourge to be as I am mine. Their sweating selves, but worse. Okay, so I'm not going to say any more about that. I'm going to move on. I don't particularly enjoy these sonnets, the terrible sonnets, but I'll go over them anyway. All right, this one is even worse, if there can be. And notice that he doesn't say no worse, which would be comparative. He uses worst, which is the superlative. In other words, this is the worst, and there is none that can compare with the worst. It's the ultimate. All right, so no worse, there is none, and that's him. That's my state, my mental state. Okay, so this is the way it goes. No worst, there is none. Pitched past pitch of grief. More pangs will school at 4 pangs, wilder spring. Comforter, where? Where is your comforting? Mary, mother of us, where is your relief? My cries heave, herds long, huddle in a main, a chief woe, world sorrow. On an age-old anvil, wince and sing, then lull, then leave off. Fury has shrieked, no lingering. Let me be fell, force I must be brief. Oh, the mind has mountains, cliffs of fall, frightful, sheer, no man fathomed. Hold them cheap may who ne'er hung there. Nor does long our small durance deal with that steep or deep. Here, creep, wretch, under a comfort serves in a whirlwind. All life death does end, and each day dies with sleep. All right, again, another abstruse poem. No surprise, because it's Hopkins. Much of it is undistinguishable, unfathomable. So he demands that we kind of rip his work apart for meaning. And he brings us with him into the deep chasms of his spirit. So he begins by telling us, my agony, my mental anguish cannot be any worse. It's pitched beyond grief. In other words, if you were to pitch it, and there was a line of grief, it goes beyond that. Okay, more pangs will. And here, second line, he says, having experienced the kind of grief I'm talking about in the past, when he knows the onset of that coming grief is approaching, it makes him feel worse. In other words, having had previous experience, this new grief that he's going to deal with, whether it's during the day or night, makes it even worse. More pangs will. Schooled, in other words, having experienced at four pangs, wilder spring. In other words, they come with more fierceness. Comforter, now he's addressing God. Where is your comforting? And Mary, mother of us, where is your relief? My cries heave like an ocean, swells. And then he says, herds long, almost like cattle, or sheep, as far as the eye can see. They huddle in a main, like the animals do. A chief woe, world sorrow, on an old, and here we have the sound of metal on metal, and that it's the anvil being struck by the mallet or the metal hammer on an age-old anvil. Wince and sing, that it's like sing. If you scream that word out, it suggests his agony. And then lull, then leave off. Fury has shrieked, no lingering. Don't be hanging around. We got to get moving. Let me be felled. Forced, I must be brief. In other words, deal with it and be done with it, kind of an attitude. And then, I read somewhere, I think it was in Mariani, that he, prior to having written this, went on a short excursion by boat to the coast of Ireland, County Clare, and there he saw the cliffs of Moher. And I think Mariani suggested that image of the cliffs might have played a part in this line when he talks about, the mind having mountains and steep valleys. You could fall from the heights to the lowest part of your mind. Oh, the mind has mountains, cliffs of fall, frightful, sheer. No man could ever have imagined, how deep a chasm one can fall into in this depression that he's talking about. And then anyone who thinks he knows about it without having experienced it doesn't know what he's talking about. And he says, hold them cheap, those who may, who ne'er hung there. In other words, you have to have experience to know what you're talking about. Nor does long our small durance deal with that steep. Why? Because it can lead to either madness or suicide. Mankind can't hold on to this kind of agony, this mental agony for so long because it would take his mind away. Nor does one long our small Dorans deal with that steep or that deep. Here, creep, and then at the end he tells us to find solace where one might. And of course, that would be at the end of each day we have sleep. So crawl into that sleep to get away from, this mental anguish. Here, creep, wretch, calls himself a wretch, under a comfort, serves in a whirlwind. All life, death does end, and each day dies with sleep. So I'll walk you through the analysis here. No worse there is none is one of his so-called terrible sonnets in which he describes a mood of dark depression, the alternatives of which are either death or madness. The poem is filled with daring linguistic innovations which make his work difficult to understand, and that's something we're familiar with. Using the structure of a sonnet, Hopkins closely analyzes his own state of mental suffering in the octave, and in the sestet offers universal comments on the effects of grief with general metaphorical overtones. I kind of stumbled over those words because I noticed a misspelling. Analyzes should be is. Analyze. No, maybe I'm right. Okay, we'll leave it alone. The first sentence states his theme. There is no bottom limit to this suffering. Suffering will eventually kill you, whether it's physical or psychological. So death is rock bottom. His wordplay in the next sentence addresses the degree and intensity of grief and depression through the word pitch, as in pitched past pitch of grief. One can interpret pitch as meaning thrown or cast, suggesting his own person being abused beyond measure or reach. In a musical sense, pitch can also suggest the strain as in a piercing or high-pitched shriek. And it's significant because think of the anvil and then the pitch of the shrieking sound of metal on metal, and that is congruent to what he's talking about, his feeling of anguish, or to scream. And the word can also mean blackness, like in coal, with the overtone of darkness of the soul. So in one word, he can, connote a number of different ideas in our mind or bring associations. All right, the second line, more pangs will ring wilder, suggests that a person who has experienced this kind of psychological suffering knows well its anguish, and therefore, being schooled at forepangs, will have an even greater aversion because of that earlier association. In other words, these pangs of misery have been wrung from me in the past, and my revisiting them will bring me even greater suffering. The next two lines, which close the octaves quatrain, pose no difficulty in their literal interpretation. Hopkins, as narrator, calls upon God and his mother, asking them where they are, where's their comfort, echoing the words of Christ on the cross, my God, why hast thou forsaken me? The second quatrain is a bit more difficult to understand. My cries heave, suggesting they are numerous and over time swell like those of waves upon the ocean, or herds long, suggesting a long train stretched out like long lines of sheep, one after the other, lending further impact to the image of many or a multitude of griefs over a long period of time. At times, these sorrows are said to huddle in a main or broad expanse, then suddenly crowd together, as in a universal kind of grief, a chief woe, a world sorrow, on an age-old anvil wince and sing. So metaphorically, One might stretch this idea of his personal woe to a universal level, a chief woe, world sorrow, by suggesting the world's universal grief over original sin, which we found in a few of his other poems, namely Spring and Fall with Margaret and others as well. The last two lines of the octave state that Fury has insisted that there should be no lingering. Let me be fell, force I must be brief. Perhaps here he's saying that in the face of peril, fell meaning deadly, one must act and act suddenly. Otherwise, the moment will be lost. The use of perforce, meaning by force of circumstances or of necessity, suggests that he must act suddenly to end this agony by confronting it rather than indulging the pangs as he has been schooled at from having experienced it so many times in his past, the four pangs. The sestet of this sonnet clearly demonstrates the nature of Hopkins' mental illness, which today clinical diagnosis might describe it as manic-depressive or bipolar, episodes of extreme mood swings from depressive lows to manic highs. These mood episodes sometimes last days to months at a time and may also be associated with suicidal thoughts, which he brings out in the poem. The sestet shifts from a personal narrative form to that of a commentary on the general nature and endurance of man and his struggle with the mind. He tells us that the mind has mountains, and we can drop from euphoria or sheer ecstasy to despair in an instant, as in the line, cliffs of fall, frightful. One might have a keener understanding of this concept as seen in the experience of a sudden tragedy, like a fatal car wreck or a drowning or a sudden death of a child. He tells us that unless one has experienced such a trauma and has had to endure its effect over a long period of time, one cannot fully empathize with another in this kind of mental anguish. Hold him cheap, may who ne'er hung there. Even more drear is the concept of those exploring the utter depths of absolute despair over a long period of time. Hopkins suggests that most people have not the endurance to do so, nor does long our small endurance deal with that steep or deep. The consequence would be madness or death. Fury, we are told in the octave, demands quick action, whatever the outcome, no lingering. He even prolongs the sound of the word lingering, through enjambment to suggest the same prolongation of this long suffering. The sonnet ends with an invitation to sleep. Here, creep. No, that's not a noun, it's a verb. Here, creep, wretch, that's a noun. Under a comfort serves in a whirlwind. The whirlwind suggests the utter turmoil of mental suffering, and in such a situation, anything will suffice to offer relief. Hopkins suggests sleep might serve as that comfort in the whirlwind by temporarily easing the agony, for just as each day closes with sleep, all life, death does end, and each day dies with sleep. Okay, I'm going to move on. This is another poem in which he's talking about pity. In Carrion, as you know, it would be dead meat, dead animals, roadkill that wild animals eat. And he says, I'm not going to partake of that kind of thing, for comfort. And of course, the metaphor is he's talking about pity, okay? So not, he begins with an emphatic negative here. Not, I'll not Carrion Comfort. So let me start it again and not break it. I'll not Carrion Comfort. Despair not feast on thee. Not untwist slack they may be, these last strands of man in me, or, most weary, cry, I can no more. I can something. Hope, wish day come, not choose not to be. But oh terrible, why wouldst thou rude me, thy wrung world, right foot rock, lay a lion limb against me, scan with darksome devouring eyes my bruised bones, and fan, in turns of tempest, me heap there, me frantic to avoid thee and flee. Why? That my chaff might fly, my grain lie, share and clear. Nay, in all that toil, that coil, since seems I kissed the rod, hand rather my heart, lo, I lapped strength, stole joy, would laugh, cheer. Cheer whom, though? The hero whose heaven handling flung me, foot trod me, oh, me that fought him, or me that fought him? Oh, which one? Is it each one? That night, that year of now done darkness, I lay wretch. Let me start that again. That year of now done darkness, I, wretch, lay wrestling with my God. My God. Okay, so this isn't as confusing as it will sound. I mean, it looks at first when we look closely. I'm just going to go right to the analysis and then go back if we have to. One of Hopkins' terrible sonnets. This begins with a rejection of the concept of accepting despair as a solace in dealing with the inner anguish. In the octave, he tells the personified comfort that comfort, is a false and corrupting form of solace, the rotting flesh of a dead animal, and hence I'll not carrion comfort. In short, he says he will not feast on self-pity, for that would be easy, and not an affirmation of the spirit. In other words, taking matters into his hands and doing something positive, not negative, okay? Negative would be laying back and just accepting it and crying, oh, poor me, poor little old me. The image in the second line changes to that of a man holding on to those last strands of his humanity. He refuses to let loose those remaining slack bonds because by doing so, it would lead to his utter madness, despair, that he gave up and in his image of himself is less. Nor will he concede defeat by saying, I cannot take any more. Instead, he says, I can. And what is it that he can't? I can do something. Hold on to hope, recognize that day follows night, or darkness of the soul gives way to light of a new day, and not accept the choice of suicide or despair, not choose, Hamlet, whether to be or not to be, choose not to be. So he says not choose not to be, the choice that Hamlet deliberated over. By saying I can, he would demonstrate an affirmation, not a passive state of acceptance. The next quatrain begins by portraying God as a cruel tormentor, using his right foot. This is the image that was rather confusing back there. And that's what he's describing. Like he's in a cradle, God's got his foot against the post of the cradle on a rocker, and he's rocking, topsy-turvy, the world of Hopkins, who's inside the cradle, as if it were a baby being rocked. But God is like kicking it, all right, turning Hopkins's world upside down. So I'll read that opening line again. The next quatrain begins by portraying God as a cruel tormentor, using his right foot to rock topsy-turvy fashion the world of Hopkins. He addresses God as, O thou terrible, meaning he is awe-inspiring to the point of terror. In other words, he's so powerful, omnipotent. Hopkins wants to know why he is being treated so roughly by a god biblically referred to as a lion who would lay a lion limb against me. The last image found in the octave is that of God with dark, devouring eyes, scanning or examining the narrator, who is seen cowering also, and covered in bruises and lying on the ground in a heap, in a cowering manner, looking up at God. This frightening image is further heightened by his words, frantic to avoid God, frantic to flee. The overall effect of this image is found in the question, but why? Why would you treat me so roughly? Why do you scan me? Why do you fan me? Hopkins' other suggested answers to these questions in the next sestet are the first part of the sonnet sestet. Line 9, the turn, suggests that God's action is one of purification. Hopkins compares himself to a mound or a heap of wheat that must be beaten by the whirlwind or fanned for the chaff to be knocked off and blown away, evoking the scriptural image found in Matthew. All right, I'm going to stop here because I should have introduced this with the idea that, in the sestet, we have a turn, and I say that in this line 9 is a turn, so that now we have a completely different take on what's been described. He raised that question, why do you do this? Why would you treat me, who have dedicated an entire life to you, giving glory to you and bringing you closer to mankind, and then you treat me this way, why? And he gives the answer now, line 9. The turn suggests that God's action is one of purifying Hopkins. All right, purification of Hopkins. Hopkins compares himself to a mound of wheat, or a heap of wheat, because he's a heap on the floor, that must be beaten by the whirlwind or fanned for the chaff to be knocked off, separating it from the wheat, and blown away, evoking the scriptural image that his winnowing fan is in his hand, and he will thoroughly clean out his threshing floor and gather his wheat into the barn. And then we see that image in the starlight night, where the barn is where Christ is with his mother, Blessed Mother, and all of the hallowed, we are told, in the sky there. And so that's the image he brings up again here. And we see it in Harrowing in Harvest as well, another poem. The next line of the sestet, recounting the struggle through the past year, all that toil, that coil, demonstrates a change in the time of the poem. Now, this is getting beyond the content of his, talking about his inner struggle. Now he's actually stepping back and talking about the time element of this period of darkness in his life, because he tells us that year of darkness, that period of time. All right? So that's what happens there. The next line of the sestet recounts his struggle through the past year, all that toil and coil. It demonstrates a change in the time of the poem, so that now we are listening to Hopkins at a later date, commenting on what the past struggle means, a coming to terms with his dark year signifies. In other words, now this is important to him because it gives him some understanding of what's going on in his world. Okay, what's happening? I've been experiencing all of this depression and this anguish. Why? And then now he answers his own question. He refers to as having kissed a hand that held the rod. Now that's, the authority. That would be God, you know. And he kissed the hand as a significant moment because he tells us since that moment he stole joy, would laugh, cheer. So that could be a combination of his going from the Anglican faith to Catholicism and then becoming a Jesuit, and dedicating his entire life to God. And the rod is, his superior, his ruler, whom he is dedicating his life to. The rod being a symbol of authority might suggest that Hopkins believes that his humble acceptance of God's cruel treatment accounts for his recovery from that inner anguish. Who knows? The last tercet then continues his observations regarding his effort to recover from his struggle. Concerning the idea of his victory, who won this battle, me or God, or both? Was it me that, won, or was it God that allowed me to win? Therefore, it was really God, kind of thing. So that question is raised here in this part of the tercet, which is the sestet. Sestet is the last 6 lines. The tercet is the last 3 lines of the sestet. So the last tercet then continues this observation regarding his effort to recover from his struggle concerning the idea of whose victory is it, victory over that inner anguish. He wonders whether he can take any pride in the victory or whether that really belongs solely to God. And then he doesn't know. So he says, or which one? Is it each one? He doesn't answer it. He ruminates on the entire ordeal and what he had heard regarding the nature of his anguish in the octave and what he questioned in the entirety of the sestet. Okay. So he ruminates on that. He deliberates, he thinks about it. And in the closing lines of the sestet, he says, that night, that year of now done darkness, it's in the past. He raises a new metaphor, like a biblical allusion to Jacob's fight with God. I, wretch, lay wrestling with my God. And when he thinks on that, he says, oh my God, it was God that I was wrestling with, And that's how the poem ends. So he likens the struggle with God to the biblical image of Jacob wrestling with the angel, and he equates his night of darkness to that year, 2 words, suggesting that his now done darkness, that he calls, lasted for a very long time, as we saw in the Worse There Is None poem, where he says a year, no, lifetime. That's what it seems. So, very long time. Now that it is behind him, he recognizes that God was always in it throughout his struggle, hence the parenthetical awareness of, oh my God, God was there all the time. And there we have this Christocentric theme again, found in all of his other works, that God played the key role and is responsible for it. And then, as I said before, in the very beginning, when I talked about the introduction to his terrible sonnets, here again we see how he was able to channel that mental anguish into something beautiful and artistic. It's a Petrarchan sonnet. And if you look closely at the rhyming, and, I tend not to get into the sound devices, and that's probably wrong, but I'm more interested in his content than I am in his, poetics. Somebody else can do that. The internal rhyme and alliteration, King Hannes, and metaphorical images and similes and all of that. That's all there, and you can deal with that. I'm more interested in the content, and because his poetry is theological, and that's what distinguishes him, for the most part, from other poets. Tennyson and Wordsworth, and Coleridge, and you name them. They're romantic poets, but they don't go beyond that. They see beauty in nature, but here Hopkins is often talking about beauty, but only as it is a reflection of God's work in creation. And then he always, signals out the idea that man is God's highest creation, making him an adopted son, and then we have the environmental poems in which man is not living up to what he was called to be, and being a caretaker for the environment. Okay. So let's read through the poem one more time and try not to stop as I normally do. Sorry about that. I'll not Carrion Comfort, despair not feast on thee, not untwist, slack they may be, these last strands of man in me, or most weary cry, I can no more, I can something, hope, wish day come, not choose not to be. But oh terrible, why wouldst thou rude me, thy ring-whirled right foot rock, lay a lion limb against me, scan with darksome devouring eyes my bruised bones, and fan